So Tom Boyce is a leading expert on the interplay between neurobiological and psychosocial processes, which leads to socially partitioned differences in childhood health, development, and disease. His work has demonstrated how psychological stress and neurobiological reactivity to adverse social contexts operate conjointly to produce disorders of both physical and mental health in childhood populations. So thank you, Tom, for taking on this task and again joining us virtually. I'll let you go ahead, and I'll come back to the mic to give you the high sign in terms of time. So talk with you soon.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you physically, but I'm glad the wonders and mysteries of modern technology, I can be with you at least virtually. I have chosen as a title for this chat this afternoon, Early Adversity in the Developing Brain, the Roles of Sensitivity, Social Orders, and Schools, which I hope will be especially relevant to those of you in the education system. We have admired for many years from afar what is going on in the field of early child development in Alberta, and please take this brief lecture as a commendation for all of the good work that all of you have done. So if we could go to the next slide, I want to start by just reviewing with you some of the major events in brain development. I guess I was hoping to do this sequentially, but it looks like I have all of the red circles up there. Just to remind you that there is an extraordinary flurry of activity that's happening biologically and even psychosocially in the months and years both before and after birth. That begins on the far left with neurulation, which in all vertebrate species is the beginning of the development of the central nervous system, where the neural plate that lies along the back of the fetus begins to infold and develops the spinal canal and ultimately the ventricular system of the brain. There is then a period of cell migration from 6 to 24 weeks prenatally in the human fetus. This is a period of time where a variety of cells are not only proliferating and replicating, but moving to different locations that is optimal for their performance within the human brain. Up at the top, you can see that postnatally and prenatally as well, there is a period of experience-dependent synapse formation at the rate of, during this period, 700 new synapses per second in the developing brain postnatally. And there is also a process of neurogenesis in the hippocampus of the brain. Also beginning very early in those first days and weeks and months of life is a process of myelination shown there in the green trajectories. This begins at a great pace immediately prior to birth and then following birth, and actually extends out on into the years of early adulthood, especially in the case of the prefrontal cortex, which is so crucial in developing capacities for emotion regulation and behavior regulation. There are also specializations of the cortex. Seeing and hearing develops in those first few months. Then there is the acquisition of language and speech capabilities. And then beyond that, as the prefrontal cortex develops and is myelinated, the development of higher cognitive functions as well. And all of these as you can see, happen predominantly, though not exclusively, in the first 1,000 days of life. It's not that there are not significant brain events in development that are happening beyond those first 1,000 days, but clearly there is a proliferation and a very special developmental period of time that is happening over those first 1,000 days. And those have implications for life course, health, and achievement on into adulthood and really over the entire life course. I could go on to the next slide. So This neuronal and brain circuitry development serves as a source of great plasticity. It is really the way that these little creatures that we love and care for so much within our human societies go from being relatively rudimentary, though elegantly complex organisms as they emerge from the womb and develop over the first few months of life into organisms of extraordinary capability and powerful ability. You can see the increasing complexity in the slides of brain neuron development going from the newborn period on through 24 months of age. And the effect of this is a powerful cumulative influence of early experience and exposures on brain architecture and function. If we go on to the next slide, the result of this is the eventual development of an organ that has 86 billion neurons, comprises 85 billion non-neuronal cells, 10,000 synapses or connections between neurons per each unit of neuron, resulting in a vast circuitry of over 100 trillion synapses in the developed brain, and really results in the development of the single most complex physical object in the known universe, with the number of neurons and connections far exceeding those of suns within and stars within the Milky Way. On to the next slide. This is really why in the work of Nobel laureate Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, he has shown vividly how those first 1,000 days of life and the exposures and experiences that children have over that period of time is really a sensitive period for intervention effects. And there is actually, as economists talk about it, a decreasing return on investment with increasing age. Again, it is not that schooling and job training that happen later in development are inert or insignificant in the developing brain of a child, but you can see that there is this kind of decreasing rate of return with the greatest and most critical exposures in those first few months and years of life. So all of this points toward the critical importance of intervening early on the child's capacity for health and achievement over the remainder of the life course. So next slide. Next slide. To summarize then this background material, child development is a critical foundation for community and economic prosperity. Capable children build successful, healthy, and sustainable societies, which is what, of course, we are all hoping we can build. Brains are constructed over developmental time, with the greatest influence during gestation and over the first 3 years of postnatal life. Brain architecture and developing abilities are built from the bottom up. It is as though simple circuits scaffold more advanced circuits and skills. Creating the right conditions for childhood development and health is more effective and less costly than addressing problems at a later stage in childhood or in adulthood. And finally, regrettably, those right conditions exist really for only a subset of the world's children, as well as for a subset of North American children. Now, why that is the case, if we go on to the next slide. If you can look up on the northwest side of this slide, physical and mental health are highly layered or partitioned by socioeconomic status. This showing socioeconomic status going from the lowest to the highest, going left to right. And on the vertical axis, the percentage of children with a variety of chronic pediatric conditions, including ear disease, physical inactivity, asthma, and injury. This is equally true of academic achievement. So the northeast side of the slide shows socioeconomic background, SES, on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, reading performance on a standardized achievement test. And again, you can see that while the slope for different countries may vary, there is still this monotonic linear association with children of higher SES backgrounds having greater reading performance over time. Now, these differences can be attributable to a whole variety of explanatory exposures, many of which I'm sure come immediately to mind as you think about these this linear gradient of health and development. Differential exposures to toxins, differences in diet, differences in access to health care, housing differences, exposures to violence, differences in parenting skills and abilities, but also differences in exposure to adversity and stress, which we think is one of the major mediators of this linkage between socioeconomic status on the one hand and health and development on the other. And it is this adversity and stress as mediators that I want to focus your attention on today for the remainder of my talk. Next slide shows the socioeconomic partitioning of stressors and adversity among children growing up in poverty versus those growing up in middle-income communities. And you can see that in the case of the density of housing, other housing problems, noise in the ambient environment, family turmoil and exposures to violence both within the family and within the neighborhood and community, that children in impoverished circumstances have far greater exposures to these stressors and adversities than do children from more advantaged communities. Next slide. This shows the sequelae at the neuronal level of these kind of early stress exposures in animal models. The control animal's neuron is on the left, the early stressed animal is on the right. And what you can easily see is a diminished and simplified dendritic branching, the branches of the tree, if you will, of the neuron, the decrease in dendritic spine density, and the shrinkage overall of the neuronal cell body. You don't need to be a neuroscientist to look at these two neurons and see that the one on the right is severely diminished relative to the complexity of the one on the left.
And
Next slide.
Tom, 4 minutes left.
Okay. Let's skip to the 12th slide. Nope, next one. So 2 findings that I'd like to share from recent research. The first is that there is tremendous individual variation in neurobiological susceptibility to stressors and adversity. The second is that there are health effects of social position in early peer hierarchies that we see within little micro-societies of school children. The next slide shows all at once 2 different versions of this socioeconomic gradient of socioeconomic status predicting reading performance. The one on the left shows on the top shows the summary that I showed you before of gradients in reading performance by SES. The one on the right shows Canadian children and shows the actual data points. And the point here is that there is a tremendous diversity underlying these linear regression line associations. You can see that it looks like a shotgun hit the screen of that association. There's a tremendous amount of variation. The same, if you look on the bottom, is true of exposures to adverse childhood events. There is a nice linear gradient shown on the left, but when you look at the actual data points, there's a tremendous diversity of response to these kinds of adverse events. The next slide shows that how, because of this extraordinary variability in response to adversity and stress, we began years ago bringing children into laboratories where we put them in front of a previously unknown examiner, had them go through a series of mildly stressful tasks, and while we were doing that, tapped into the two major stress response systems within the human brain, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical system shown in purple, which is the cortisol system, and the locus coeruleus norepinephrine autonomic system, which is shown in blue, and that is the system which ignites the entire fight or flight response. Next slide.
1 more minute, Tom.
1 more minute. Well, then let's go to the 22nd slide. This is the slide that is labeled the crux of the argument. Okay. So I'm going to skip all the data and just tell you what I was planning to tell you. Here are the 3 points that I hope I can leave you with. I'm sorry that I don't have the time to actually show you the research that lies behind the findings, but here they are. The first is that exposures to stress and adversity in early life can have powerful, enduring influences on the developing brain, on the capacities for learning and academic achievement, on vulnerability to mental and physical disorders, and on lifelong health and well-being. These early major influences on the developing brain are really what sculpts our entire society and its capacities for flexibility, for creativity, and for learning. The second point is that there are broad, substantial individual differences in children's susceptibility to adversity, with a subset of children that show heightened sensitivity to both adversity and to supportive social environments. So there are these children who have heightened sensitivity to social environments, both positive and negative, and these are children that I think we need to be particularly aware of and sensitive to in the developing of educational systems, in the way we parent, and so on. Third and final point is that paralleling the social partitioning of health in human adult societies, children occupying subordinate lower positions in their peer hierarchies that evolve and develop within the classrooms of young children sustain disproportionate rates of mental and physical health symptoms, which can be ameliorated by teachers' use of more egalitarian pedagogical practices. Kids as young as 2, 3, 4, 5 develop pecking orders of dominance hierarchies, and preschool and primary school teachers can do much to ameliorate the health and developmental effects of subordinate positions within those hierarchies. And I think I've gone even over my last minute.
Tom, I just want to thank you so much for that presentation, but also your flexibility. I know there are likely many people who have many questions for you now, so I think we just have a couple of minutes before the next presenter for any questions in the room, or if those online would like to send in their questions as well, that's an opportunity to put those forward. So please show your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We'll get a mic to you right away. So, Tom, you may have another minute here if there are no questions. Okay, thank you. We're just taking the mic to someone who will be with you just a sec.
Hi there. I was wondering if you found any common factors among those who were highly sensitive to their environment. Did you do any further research? Were there biological factors that were common among those kids?
I lost the last part of your question. Were there common features to those kids?
Yeah, who were highly sensitive to their environment.
Yeah, well, what I didn't get to show you at all is the fact that in these laboratory experiments that we did with children, those who were highly sensitive to their environment responded in these two stress response systems with heightened reactivity biologically in the way that they responded to these challenging tasks that we put before them. These are kids who tend to be, in general, shyer children. They are more behaviorally inhibited. They withdraw from novel experiences. But they are children who actually do beautifully and thrive remarkably in environments where they are supported, where things are predictable, where they are encouraged and supported in a variety of different ways. So they are children who have either the worst outcomes or the best outcomes, depending upon the character of the social setting that they are being reared in, be that a family or an educational system or a peer hierarchy or whatever.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead. They're bringing a mic over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. My question is the other end of the spectrum. And so you've shared with us your observations about hypersensitive children. What about the children in that environment who, despite the adversity, may have done better and coped more effectively than others? What could you tell us that the data said about them?
Yeah. These are actually the majority of children in our research. You know, we talk and think about resilience as something that is sequestered in a little subpopulation of children. We think of resilient children as being those who, in the face of inordinate adversity, seem to thrive. And there definitely are those children, but what our research seems to indicate is that the majority of children, in our samples, 80 to 85% of children who are experiencing these mildly stressful challenges that we put to them in the lab, they do just fine, and they are lower in biological reactivity to the social environment, and in real life, under normative conditions of challenge and sort of species typical adversity, these are kids who do very well. We call them our dandelion children after a Swedish term, Maskrosbarn, which means dandelion child. And what the Swedes mean by that is that there is this group of children who, like the dandelion, can thrive in almost any environment in which they are planted.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for that. We'll now move on to the... we don't have time for more questions now, but I'd please ask you to, and I'll take the online question at the end of all of the speakers, so we'll have a chance to have more conversation once all of the panelists are finished.